Chapters 19 and 20 of Napoleon and Marie-Louise, The Fall of the Empire, by Walter Geer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 19. 1810. The Journey to France. After so much excitement, Monday the 12th of March was passed by Louise quietly with her family. The Emperor Francis seized this occasion to write a first letter to his new son-in-law, and dispatch it by his chamberlain, Comte de Clary. At the end he says, "Comte de Metternich, who follows Comte de Clary in a few days, will be charged to express verbally to your Imperial Majesty the attachment which I have vowed to a prince who since yesterday is one of the most precious members of my family. At this moment I do no more than to pray him to receive the assurance of my esteem and of my unalterable friendship." During the same day, Berthier left Vienna for Braunau, on the Bavarian frontier, where he was to await the arrival of Marie-Louise, and escort her to France. On Tuesday morning, the Empress Marie-Louise left Vienna at an early hour in an 8-horse carriage, accompanied by the Comtesse de Lasansky, Grand Mistress of her household. There were 10 6-horse carriages filled with the gentlemen and ladies of her suite, and the escort comprised several squadrons of cavalry. The Emperor had set out an hour earlier for Linz, where he was to embrace his daughter for the last time. The journey was one continual ovation. In all the cities and towns through which she passed, the Empress received the homage of the authorities. On Friday morning she reached Altheim, on the border of Bavaria, which as a member of the Confederation of the Rhine was considered French territory. Here the ceremony of the remise was to take place. Louise was to be given up to the French mission, who were to conduct her to Compiègne. The formalities were all copied from those observed 40 years before on the occasion of the marriage of Marie Antoinette to the Dauphin of France. On the frontier line there had been constructed 3 connecting pavilions, of which the first was considered Austrian territory, the third French, and the one in between, neutral ground. 3 French regiments, 1 of cavalry and 2 of infantry in gala uniforms were waiting to form the escort. The commissioner to receive the Empress was Marshal Berthier, who was accompanied by his secretary, Comte de Laborde. For the head of the French mission, Napoleon had selected his sister Caroline, a very remarkable choice, when we consider that she was occupying the throne of Naples, from which Louise's grandmother Caroline had been driven by the French. The other members of the mission were the Duchesse de Montebello, widow of Marshal Lannes, and several other ladies of the palace, as well as about a dozen chamberlains and prefects of the palace. At 1 o'clock the French mission assembled in their pavilion, the men in full dress and the women in court gowns. A little later Marie-Louise arrived. She was conducted to the middle room, and seated on the throne prepared for her. The Austrian commissioner and his secretary placed themselves at the table, and the other members of the mission were grouped around the room. In the meantime the French mission were anxiously waiting in the adjoining room for a sight of their new sovereign. In his Mémoire, M. de Beausset confesses that he had brought a gimlet, with which he bored several holes through the partition. The ladies and gentlemen of the party were thus enabled to get a preliminary view of the features of the Empress. The prefect goes into raptures over the beauty of Marie-Louise. "She was standing upon her throne," he writes. "Her tall figure was perfect. Her hair was blonde and admirable. Her blue eyes announced all the candor and all the innocence of her soul. Her face beamed with freshness and goodness. She wore a robe of golden brocade with large flowers of natural color woven in the silk, which was so heavy it must have fatigued her greatly. She had suspended at her neck the portrait of Napoleon, enriched with 16 magnificent solitaires, which altogether had cost 500,000 francs." The French mission were then invited to enter, and the ceremony of the remise took place. The acts were signed and sealed. The 2 secretaries counted the dot, 500,000 francs in new golden ducats, and verified the inventory of the jewels, for which a receipt was given. Meanwhile the members of the Austrian party filed before the Empress, and kissed her hand. Her eyes were wet with tears, and her emotion won the hearts of all, writes M. de Beausset. The Empress then took the hand of the Prince de Neuchâtel, and advanced to the rear of the room, where the French party was grouped. The members of the mission were then presented to her by name. Finally, Caroline made her appearance, and embraced her new sister in law. After a few moments of conversation they entered a carriage with 8 white horses, and proceeded to Braunau, followed by the members of the 2 missions, in 6-horse carriages, and escorted by the French troops. Through the illuminated streets they reached the lodging which had been prepared by piercing the walls of several houses. In one of the rooms the trousseau de voyage was ready, and Marie-Louise, delivered over to her dame d'atour and the femme de chambre, was shortly dressed from head to foot, from coiffure to shoes, à la Française. She then received the hosts of her household, and at 6:30 dined with Caroline and Madame Lasansky. In another room Prince de Neuchâtel and the Duchesse de Montebello presided over a banquet of 70 couverts given to the Austrian and French missions. But neither the food nor the wines served to remove the constraint and create a feeling of good fellowship. Everything was in contrast: the toilettes, the fashions, the décolletage, the coiffures, the manner even of carrying themselves and putting on airs. Of what account were the names? These people, men and women, had they not rallied to the Empire, therefore to the Revolution? Were they not French? At the same time the 2 French generals gave to the Austrian officers a dinner, which was marked by the mutual courtesy of the guests. As Geer said, "The women showed an ill will which their husbands, tired of war, did not display." Berthier had received his present before leaving Vienna, a portrait medallion of the Emperor, set in diamonds, and suspended from the Order of the Toison d'Or. The gifts distributed to the other members of the French mission at Braunau were on a scale of equal magnificence. In comparison, the presents sent by the Emperor Napoleon were much more ordinary, and Berthier was obliged to borrow emeralds and diamonds of the value of over 30,000 francs from the Duchesses de Montebello and de Bassano in order to satisfy the expectations of the Austrian ladies. This produced a bad effect, and added to the ill feeling. That evening, before retiring, as tired as she was, after so fatiguing a day, Marie-Louise wished for the last time to write her father freely. The Austrian commissioner, to whom she confided the letter, was leaving the next morning for Vienna, and she felt that this was her last chance to express her feelings, without the danger of her words being reported to Napoleon by the secret police. This letter, so touching in its simplicity, is worth quoting at length. "Dear Father, pardon me for not having written to you yesterday, as it was my duty to do. I was prevented by the journey, which was long and very tiresome. I am glad to seize the occasion of the departure of Prince de Tormensdorf to assure you of my constant thoughts of you. God has given me the strength to bear the cruel emotion of this separation from all my family. In Him I have placed my reliance. He will support me, and will give me the courage to fulfill my mission. My consolation will be in the thought of the sacrifice made for you. Ah, Dieu, what a difference there is between the French ladies and the Austrians! The Queen of Naples came to meet me, took me in her arms, and displayed for me a surprising tenderness. But nevertheless I have no confidence in it. I do not think that the desire to be useful to me is the only object of her journey. She came with me to Braunau, and there I had to endure a toilette 2 hours long. I assure you that I am already as scented as the other French women. The Emperor Napoleon has sent me a superb golden toilette case. He has not yet written me. Since it was necessary for me to leave you, I would like much better to be with him than to travel with all these ladies. Ah, Dieu! How I regret the happy moments passed with you! It is only now that I appreciate them. I assure you, dear papa, that I am sad and inconsolable. I hope that your cold is over. I pray for you every day. Excuse my scrawl. I have so little time. I kiss your hands 1,000 times, and I have the honor to be, dear papa, your obedient and humble daughter, Marie-Louise. Braunau, 16 March, 1810. That evening the Empress bade farewell to all the persons who had accompanied her from Vienna, except Madame Lasansky, who was expected to remain with her for at least a year. The next morning at an early hour she set out for Munich, where she arrived at 10 o'clock in the evening. The following day, which was passed in the Bavarian capital, she received a letter from Napoleon brought by one of his equerries. That evening a grand dinner was given in her honor at the palace. Before leaving Munich, to her great surprise and grief, Marie-Louise was notified by the Queen of Naples that, under orders of the Emperor, her companion, Madame Lazenski, must return to Vienna. Caroline had taken a dislike to the lady, and wished to get rid of her in order to exercise a complete influence over the new Empress. But the Queen, who thought that she had divined the character of Marie-Louise, was entirely mistaken. She took her timidity for weakness, her embarrassment for gaucherie. She believed that she had only to command to assure her domination, but she turned the indifference of her sister-in-law into active dislike. The Empress might have resisted, for they showed her no order from Napoleon, and indeed his sister in this matter went directly contrary to his wishes. But Louise gave way for the sake of peace and let her friend depart. "I could not make a greater sacrifice for my husband," she wrote her father, "and moreover I do not believe that it was in his thought." In this surmise she was entirely correct, for Napoleon had written Count Otto the last of February that there would be no objection to the Empress having a dame de compagnie during the journey, and that he preferred a companion to a maid. The sudden and unexpected return of the Comtesse to Vienna made a great sensation, and created a very unfavorable impression on all classes of society. The reconciliation with France on the part of the aristocracy, and indeed of the nation generally, was far from sincere. The Viennese, excited by Russian and English emissaries, gathered in the streets and public places, and were loud in their complaints of the sacrifice imposed upon their sovereign. The authorities were obliged to use force to quell these disturbances. In a dispatch to Champagny, under date of the 24th of March, Otto states that the Emperor had referred to this matter in a private audience which was accorded him at the palace. "What have you done to Madame Lazenski?" demanded the Emperor. "Why send her back? Your master had given my daughter the privilege of taking a dame de compagnie, and if there were an exception to make, Madame Lazenski deserved to be the one, for she has always shown herself very favorable to France. But then I must say that I attach no importance to the matter. The public, however, is amusing itself in forming 1,000 absurd conjectures, and last night they made a disturbance in the city and the suburbs." In the meantime the Empress was continuing her journey, suffering from a bad cold and ever increasing fatigue. At the capitals of Würtemberg and Baden she received the same cordial reception as at Munich. Caroline, by her incessant complaints, continued to increase the antipathy she had inspired in her sister-in-law, and proved herself an almost insufferable traveling companion. On the 24th March, after retiring at midnight, it was necessary to rise at daybreak, and leave Carlsruhe at 8, in order to reach the bridge across the Rhine before sunset. At Strasbourg the Empress was received by 20 generals and several divisions under arms. Here at last she was on French soil. The popular enthusiasm was great and universal, because the people thought that they saw in Marie-Louise not only the most brilliant trophy of the French arms, but also, after 18 years of war, the gage of a peace this time assured. At Strasbourg the Empress had the pleasure of seeing a familiar face in Comte de Metternich, who was on his way to Paris. She also probably saw the Austrian general, Comte de Neipperg, whose presence at the fête was mentioned in a local newspaper. Who would then have imagined that this unknown officer would, only 5 years later, be the successor of the Emperor of the French in the affections of Marie-Louise? Napoleon left the Tuileries at 3 o'clock on the afternoon of Tuesday, the 20th of March, and arrived 4 hours later at Compiègne, where for a week he anxiously awaited the arrival of his bride. He had ordered the château repaired and magnificently decorated and refurnished. The garden was replanted and ornamented with statues. All the members of the imperial family had arrived, and everything was ready for the reception of the new Empress. The plans for the meeting with Marie-Louise had been carefully arranged in the most minute detail. Halfway between Soissons and Compiègne, a pavilion had been erected composed of 3 tents, all hung in purple and gold. On the 28th of March, the Emperor and his party, escorted by the cavalry of the Imperial Guard, were to proceed from Compiègne, and wait in the first tent. On the arrival of the Empress, she was to enter the third tent. Then Napoleon and Marie-Louise were to enter the center tent, where they were to see each other for the first time. After this meeting they were to be escorted back to Compiègne in a state carriage. The Empress was to be installed in the Château, and the Emperor was to pass the night in the Hotel of the Chancellery. At noon on Tuesday, the 27th of March, Napoleon received a letter from Louise stating that she was hastening her journey, and was leaving Vitry-le-François that same morning for Soissons. At the moment the letter reached him, Napoleon was walking in the park. On hearing that Louise was so near, he could repress his impatience no longer. He sent for Murat, and they left the park by a side gate where a small carriage was in waiting, driven by a servant in plain livery. Traveling at full speed, they soon passed Soissons and reached the relay station in the little village of Courcelles. When they arrived there, the rain was falling in torrents. Napoleon and Murat descended from the carriage, and sought shelter under the porch of a church opposite the relay post. A few minutes later the traveling coach of the Empress appeared, and drew up at the post house to change horses. Napoleon rushed to the door of the carriage, and entering took Marie-Louise in his arms. She had been warned of his presence a moment before by a postilion, who cried, "L'Empereur!" Directing Murat to take the front seat beside his wife, Napoleon placed himself at the side of Marie-Louise, and ordered the postilions to proceed at full speed to Compiègne. A courier sent ahead announced their arrival for 10 o'clock that evening. As soon as the news was received at the Château, preparations were made in haste for the reception of the Emperor and Empress. Marshal Bessières, at the head of the cavalry of the guard, galloped to the stone bridge, where 40 years before Louis XV had welcomed the Dauphine, Marie Antoinette. In spite of the storm, the inhabitants of the town crowded the streets. About 9:30 the arrival of the imperial couple was announced by a salute of 101 guns. The carriages rapidly traversed the avenues, and drew up at the door of the château, where the princes and princesses were waiting at the foot of the staircase. Napoleon descended first, offered his hand to Louise, and conducted her to the salon, where he presented to her, in turn, all the ladies and then the men. This ceremony finished, he conducted the Empress to her apartment, where they had supper, with no one present except the Queen of Naples. Meanwhile, the court were anxiously waiting for the Empress to descend after completing her toilette. When an hour had passed and every one was nearly famished, the Chamberlain Bertrand appeared and announced, "Their Majesties have retired." Then he whispered to his wife, "Ils sont couchés." The surprise was great, but no remarks were made, and they all went to supper. 1810. The ceremonies at Paris. After the arrival of the Empress, the court remained only 2 days at Compiègne before proceeding to Paris for the civil and religious celebrations of the marriage. On Wednesday, the 28th of March, the ladies and gentlemen who had not made the journey to Braunau were presented. Marie-Louise had the pleasure of a long conversation with her uncle, the Archduke Ferdinand, the former Grand Duke of Tuscany, who was now known as the Grand Duke of Würzburg. She also saw and talked with the Austrian ambassador, Prince de Schwarzenberg, and the Comte de Metternich and his wife. Napoleon had never appeared so happy. He was fairly radiant with joy. That evening, contrary to his usual custom, he dressed for dinner, and wore for the first time the costume which his sister Pauline had persuaded him to order. But the habit did not become him, and he fell ill at ease. Ever afterwards he wore on nearly all occasions the familiar green uniform of the chasseur à cheval of his guard, assuming for Sundays and days of gala his blue uniform with white facings. On Thursday Comte de Praslin was leaving for Vienna, and Napoleon and Marie-Louise charged him with letters for the Emperor. In her letters at this time the Empress refers frequently to the affectionate reception which she had received from all the members of the Bonaparte family, including those implacable enemies of Joséphine, Madame Mère, and Queen Caroline. Friday the court left Compiègne for St. Cloud, arriving in time for dinner. The following day there were no ceremonies, except a theatrical performance given in the evening. The civil marriage of Napoleon and Marie-Louise was celebrated at the Château of St. Cloud on Sunday, the 1st of April, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in the Gallery of Apollo. For Napoleon, this room recalled many memories. It was here that the ancients had sat on the decisive day of the 19 Brumaire, and that he had taken the oath as consul in the gloom of the early hours of the following morning. Here, too, on a glorious spring day, the 18th of May, 1804, he had been proclaimed Emperor of the French. All of the Bonaparte princes and princesses were present, except King Joseph, who was absent in Spain. The ceremony of the civil marriage was very brief and very simple. Omitting the repetition of the titles, the form was as follows. In answer to the question of the Arch-Chancellor, Napoleon replied, "Je déclare prendre en mariage Marie-Louise, ici présente." The same interpellation was addressed to Marie-Louise, and answered in the same form. Then the Arch-Chancellor, Cambacérès, pronounced the marriage in these terms: "In the name of the Emperor and of the law, I declare that the Emperor Napoleon and the Archduchess Marie-Louise are united in marriage." At the same moment the ceremony was announced by salvos of artillery at St. Cloud, repeated by the guns of the Invalides at Paris. The marriage formalities were terminated by the signature of the act, first by Napoleon and Marie-Louise, and then by all the witnesses of the ceremony. It was rather a remarkable fact that the weather was fair this Sunday at St. Cloud, while the city of Paris, only a few miles away, was deluged by a tropical storm. On the contrary, it rained Monday at St. Cloud, and the weather in Paris was magnificent. Even the skies seemed to smile on Napoleon. Great preparations had been made at Paris for the religious ceremony on Monday, the 2nd of April. The Arc de Triomphe, under which the procession was to pass, was then only just commenced, but a framework covered with canvas was erected on the stone base, and furnished a semblance of the completed structure. The procession was led by the cavalry of the Imperial Guard. Then came the Emperor and Empress in the celebrated carriage of the coronation. 4 marshals of France, the colonel generals of the Guard, rode beside the doors. Then followed all the dignitaries of the Empire in other carriages, and the rest of the escort. The cannon of the Invalides thundered, bands played triumphal marches, and all the bells in Paris were ringing. Descending the magnificent avenue of the Champs-Élysées, and traversing the Place de la Concorde, where less than 17 years before, the head of Marie Antoinette, the grand aunt of Marie-Louise, had fallen under the guillotine, the cortege reached the Tuileries by the way of the gardens. The Emperor and Empress mounted the grand staircase to the state apartments on the first floor, and reached, by way of the Pavillon de Flore, the grand gallery of the Louvre. This gallery, a quarter of a mile in length, was lined on either side by 2 rows of benches, upon which 4,000 ladies were seated, while the same number of men stood in double rank behind them. Shut in by the barriers which kept the centre free for the passage of the procession, these spectators had been waiting for 5 hours. Refreshments were served, and a number of bands played martial airs, so the time passed quickly. At 3 o'clock the head of the procession appeared. For this occasion the celebrated Salon Carré, between the long gallery and the Salon d'Apollon, had been transformed into a chapel. The altar was at the eastern end, and tribunes had been erected on the 3 other sides of the room. 30 feet in front of the altar, upon a platform and under a dais, 2 armchairs and 2 prie-dieu had been placed for the sovereigns. They were met at the door by the Grand Almoner, Cardinal Fesch, who presented the holy water. Napoleon and Marie-Louise took their seats, the Emperor at the right. On his side were placed the princes of the family, and on the side of the Empress all the princesses, in the order of their rank. In the tribunes were seated the grand dignitaries of the Empire, and distinguished guests. Suddenly the face of Napoleon, previously so smiling, became dark with rage when he noticed the many vacant places in the ranks of the cardinals. The 13 Italian prelates were absent. After the marriage ceremony, the Emperor and Empress returned to the Tuileries, where from the balcony of the Salle des Maréchaux they reviewed the cavalry and infantry of the Imperial Guard, who defiled in the court below. At 7 o'clock in the evening a grand banquet was given in the theatre of the Château. After the dinner, the sovereigns appeared upon the balcony of the central Pavillon de l'Horloge, and were cheered by the enormous crowd of people in the gardens. Then there was a concert, followed by a grand display of fireworks in the gardens and the entire length of the Champs Elysées. The sight from the Tuileries was magnificent beyond description. The following day, Tuesday, all the great bodies of the State presented their homages to the Emperor and Empress in the throne room of the Tuileries. The 13 cardinals who had refused to attend the ceremony on Monday were present in the Salle des Maréchaux, awaiting the moment to pay their respects. At the end of 3 hours an aide de camp of the Emperor appeared, and brought them the order to leave at once, as His Majesty refused to see them. In vain the 13 wrote a joint letter of excuse, in which they declared that they had never presumed either to pass judgment on the first marriage of the Emperor, or to raise doubts as to the legitimacy of the second. Napoleon deprived them of their charges and their red robes as cardinals. Forced to resume the costumes of ordinary priests, they were subsequently called the Black Cardinals. They were interned in different cities of France under the supervision of the police, and lived entirely on the charity of the faithful. But the battle is not always to the strong. The Pope was to return in triumph to the Eternal City, and his persecutor, the all-powerful Emperor, was to die a captive on the rock of St. Helena. In connection with the religious marriage there is a curious fact not generally known. The act signed after the ceremony by Cardinal Fesch gives as the date, the 1st day of April, first Sunday in Lent. Both facts incorrect. Napoleon thoroughly enjoyed his honeymoon with Marie-Louise. Within 48 hours after his first marriage he had been forced to leave Paris to take command of the army of Italy, and he had been separated from his wife most of the time during the next 6 months. After the faded charms of Joséphine, Louise was to him a new and delightful experience. The first morning at Compiègne he said to one of his familiars, "My dear fellow, marry a German girl. They are the best wives in the world, sweet, good, simple, and fresh as a rose." Like Joséphine, Louise never opposed him in any way, and his slightest wish was to her a command. But unlike his first wife, Louise had religious and moral principles. She had no desire to mingle in politics, but she rallied to the Empire the last intransigeants of the Ancien Regime. A bond of union between the France of the past and the present, she seemed to hold out the hope of repose for all Europe, and to ensure the stability of the imperial edifice. Napoleon displayed great regard for his young wife, and in his tenderness there was mingled the love of a husband and of a father. At the age of 40 the Emperor was much handsomer than in his youth. The celebrated snuff-box portrait of Paul de la Roche gives a good idea of his appearance at this time. His manners also had changed. From being brusque and frequently violent he had become calm and affable. The Republican general had given place to a majestic monarch, familiarized with all the usages of courts, with all the rules of etiquette, holding his rank like a Louis XIV, and playing his role of sovereign with the ease and talent of a great actor. From being taciturn he had become a fluent talker, and his conversation possessed a charm which few could resist. Formerly careless of his personal appearance even to the point of neglect, he was now always perfectly groomed. He not only endeavored to fascinate his young wife, he took pains to please her. In brief, the marriage began under the most favorable auspices. The satisfaction at Vienna equaled that at Paris. On the 8th of April the French ambassador, Comte Otto, wrote the Duc de Cadore, "The letters which the Emperor and Empress of Austria have received successively from their Majesties have caused them the greatest pleasure, but especially those presented night before last by Comte de Praslin. The Emperor was touched even to tears. Also by the 2 letters written by the Empress in German, in which she says among other things, 'I am as happy as it is possible to be. What my father frequently said is verified, I find the Emperor extremely affectionate.' In communicating these details to me, Prince de Metternich wept for joy, and threw himself upon my neck to embrace me." The celebrated Metternich, who at that time bore the title of Comte, had left his father, the Prince, in charge of the Bureau of Foreign Affairs at Vienna, during his visit to Paris for the marriage ceremonies. Now that these were over he counted on returning to his post, but was kept in Paris for 6 months. In a conversation with the Emperor he had avowed his ambition to find a line to follow in politics in a distant future. Napoleon replied, "I understand you, and your desires conform to my own. Remain a few weeks longer with us, and you shall have full satisfaction." Very amiable and charming, a thorough man of the world, a consummate diplomat, marvelously well informed regarding France and the French, on very confidential, not to say intimate terms, with Napoleon and all the members of the imperial family, Metternich enjoyed a very privileged position at the court of the Tuileries. One day Napoleon asked him why he never visited the Empress except on the days of her receptions, when any one could go. "Come to see her to morrow morning," he continued. "I will tell her to expect you." The following morning, therefore, Metternich went to the Tuileries, where he found Napoleon in the private apartment of the Empress. After a few words the Emperor left them alone, closing and locking the door behind him. At the end of nearly an hour Napoleon returned, laughing, and cried, "Well, have you had a good talk? Did the Empress have much evil to say of me? Has she laughed or cried? I do not call you to account. Those are your secrets between you two, which do not concern a third party, even if the third party is the husband." When Napoleon saw Metternich again, he said, "The Empress must have told you that she is happy with me, that she has no complaint to make. I hope that you will say so to your Emperor, and that he will believe you more than others." As a matter of fact, Metternich did report the incident to the Emperor Francis, and he believed it, as he had every reason to do, for Marie-Louise was perfectly happy. End of chapters 19 and 20.